Lord, just thank you for this place that we can gather as the world around us. There's so much going on. There's so much noise. There's so much evil. There's just a lot of heartbreaking things happening. Lord, just thank you for this place that we can come to just really be with you, Lord, be with one another, to be worshiping together, Lord, to just be reminded that you are in control of all things, Lord, and that we can look to you for our help and our strength, Lord, and that you are the giver of peace. And we just thank you for those promises, Lord. And now as we prepare to hear from your word, Lord, may the message of pastor's words and the meditations of our hearts be honor and glory to you, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You may be seated.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be together this morning. We are going to be jumping back into our series that we've started, our series in the book of Nehemiah, and we're going to be looking at that book. And I'm going to try to get my technology to work as I usually do. But we're going to be looking at the book of Nehemiah again together this morning. We started last week with our new sermon series on the book of Nehemiah. And we got the background of what was going on in the book of Nehemiah and talked about the fact that Nehemiah is not just a book that is about the history of Israel and God's people, but it's also a book that addresses a lot of other issues, a lot of other things that were going on at the time. And so part of what Nehemiah is about is kind of this story, this history that kind of follows through with the people of Israel. It's a message of an encouragement. It's a message of discouragement sometimes. There's persecution. There's disappointment. There's triumph. All of these things are wrapped up in this book of Nehemiah. And we're looking at all of those things together, and we're looking specifically at how God moved not just Nehemiah, but also the people of Israel to action, how they were moved to action. And we talked a little bit about that last week. We talked a little bit about how being moved to action is a matter of listening to God's prompting in our lives and then responding to that. And we talked about how Nehemiah did that, specifically how Nehemiah did that with prayer and how that was kind of his first place that he went to when he was feeling moved by God. He went to prayer. So that's kind of where we've been, and this week I kind of gave you a teaser last week of there's some action that Nehemiah is being drawn to beyond just praying about what God has for the nation of Israel and the people that are returning. But Nehemiah this week is going to be doing something that's kind of hard. It's a hard thing. He's going to be faced with something that is one of the hard things. And growing up, this was kind of a thing in my family. I don't know if it was a thing in some of your families. But growing up, quite often when there was something that needed to be done, this phrase, the hard thing, got broken out, right? And maybe you've used it. I know I've used it with my kids sometimes, of sometimes you have to do the hard thing. Or maybe doing the hard thing is good for you. But this idea of the hard thing was something that was talked about in my family growing up, and it's been talked about in my family since. And what I came to realize, at least at the time, when I heard the phrase, doing the hard thing, it kind of meant one of three things to me. Either it was, doing the hard thing was something that I didn't want to do, all right? So sometimes when I heard the phrase, doing a hard thing, it's something I didn't want to do. Usually it was a chore, something around the house or something on the farm that needed done. It was a chore, something I really didn't want to do. And this phrase, doing the hard thing, got brought out. Sometimes it was doing something that was literally hard to accomplish. We would be doing something that required a lot of effort to do. It was challenging. Maybe it was challenging to the skills that I had. Maybe it was challenging to me physically. But it was something that was challenging sometimes. And I was challenged to do something that was literally hard to do, hard to accomplish. And sometimes it was used of something that I really wanted to do, but I was afraid to do it. sometimes that phrase, the hard thing, was used of something that I really wanted to do, but maybe I was just a little afraid to do it. And all three of those things are going to play into our story of Nehemiah this morning. And I think there's some reasons why people don't do the hard thing, why we're hesitant to do the hard thing. There are reasons I had for being hesitant to do the hard thing. And some of the reasons you might come up with when you're faced with the hard thing, there's kind of two responses. Like one, I think, one that maybe I was more prone to in my youth, but still sometimes today, is the idea of laziness. Like, I see the hard thing, and I think to myself, that is a hard thing. I'm like, why would I do the hard thing when I could maybe do the easy thing, or maybe do nothing at all? It's that idea of laziness. I just don't want to put forth the effort to do it. And so that's kind of the one of the main reasons I don't do the hard thing if I examine myself. I think the other reason that we don't do the hard thing, or I don't do the hard thing, and I think it's common to a lot of people. I think almost everybody faces that. And when you're faced with the hard thing, I think sometimes the reason we don't do the hard thing is because there's a fear of failure. There's a fear of failure. When we're faced with the hard thing, I think sometimes we don't do the hard thing because there's a fear that we aren't going to be able to accomplish a hard thing. It might be a fear of physical failure. I can remember maybe a hard thing when I learned to ski, of being at the top of like a blue diamond and looking down the slope and thinking to myself, I really want to get to the bottom here, but I have a legitimate fear that there's going to be some physical harm on the way down, right? Maybe that's not a common thing, and maybe there was a little physical harm on the way down, but it's maybe not a common thing that we face every day of the physical harm, but it is a fear that we might have. I think sometimes it's the fear that there's going to be a relational fallout to what we do, right? We fear that if we do something hard, it's going to affect our relationships with other people. And that might be a fear that your relationship with somebody you're close with is altered, or it might be the fear that the way that other people see you is going to be altered. If I do this hard thing, people are going to think of me in this way. It's a form of relational failure, and we're afraid that those things might happen. And then the third way maybe that we would say, oh, I fail at a hard thing. Maybe it's a material failure. Maybe it's something like, I felt God called me to do something, and I'm afraid that my efforts will be wasted, whether that's the money that I put into it, or the time that I put into it, or the things that I have built in order for this to happen. We're afraid that maybe those things might be wasted effort, that they might be lost, or maybe as a result of our hard decision, those things might be taken away from us. And today's text that we're looking at in Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah is faced with kind of all of these things. He is faced with a hard decision. He's faced with kind of all of these things. And so we're going to look at the text this morning. I'm going to give us a 30-second refresher, just so if you weren't here last week, you know why we're in Nehemiah, or what we're doing in Nehemiah and what we're talking about. But the setting for today's story in Nehemiah is the setting of people returning from exile. So we talked about last week how God's people walked away from him, and as a result of that, he allowed them to be taken into captivity. They spent 70 years in captivity to the Babylonians and then the Persians, and then God brings them back to Jerusalem and to Judea, where they were from. He brings them back into the land, and so they're coming back into the land, and they've been there for a number of years. King Cyrus has allowed them to rebuild the temple. The temple is rebuilt, but the walls are in shambles. The city isn't really occupied. And so Nehemiah gets a report from his brother. Nehemiah at the time is living in the capital of Persia, in Susa. He gets a report from his brother that the city is in disaster. And at that point, Nehemiah is moved to action. And that's our theme for the week, kind of move to action. And so all these things are going on. Nehemiah is moved to action. And the first place that Nehemiah turns is to prayer. He turns to pray. It says he is mourned. He mourns what's going on, and he fasts and he prays. And so you can see in chapter 1, verse 5, he talks about that the city had been in disgrace. Why is that such a big deal, that the city of Jerusalem's walls are torn down, that the city is kind of in disgrace? Why does that even matter to Nehemiah? Nehemiah has never lived in Jerusalem. It is where his family is from, but he never lived there. Why does that matter? We talked a little bit about it last week, but it matters because throughout the scripture up to this point, in David's writings, even further back, Jerusalem is thought of, and the people of Israel thought of Jerusalem as the city of God. If you go through the Psalms especially, Jerusalem is referred to as the city of God over and over and over. And what seems to be the common thought of the people of Israel at this period is that our city, the city that God said was his city, is laying in ruins, and all the people around the area are looking at the city of Jerusalem, and they're saying, the city is in ruins. Why would we ever follow a God who lets their city be in ruins? And so the people of Israel that is why Nehemiah is grieved the city is in ruins. It's not necessarily just the fact that there's a town somewhere that's been burnt to the ground. It is that the city of God, the place that God has said his presence is in, as it was with Solomon's temple, his presence is there. The city of God is in ruins, and people are looking at that and saying, a ruined city equals a powerless God. And so when Nehemiah sees that, he's grieved and he's moved to prayer. And we talked last week about this prayer that Nehemiah prays to God. And we finished it up kind of with this teaser of the last verse of chapter 1. It says in the last verse of chapter 1, Nehemiah asks that, sorry, I have to put my glasses. Nehemiah asks God that he would give his servant success today and have compassion on him in the presence of this man. He just says this man at the end of this statement. We don't know who, if we don't read any further, we don't know who this man is. But Nehemiah knows who this guy is, and it's because Nehemiah understands that if he's going to be moved in the way that God has called him to be moved, he is going to have to go through the king of Persia to accomplish what he feels God's called him to. And so he writes this phrase at the end of his prayer, and he begins, his first step in action really is to begin in prayer. I'm going to read our text this morning, and we'll kind of make some observations like we did last week. We'll make some observations from the text, and then we'll say, what do those observations mean to us? So if you have a Bible with you, open it up to Nehemiah chapter 2. We've got the words up here on the screen. I know they're a little hard to read, but they're also on the back of your Sunday. If you're like me and you have problems reading things that are hard to read, they're there. But read with me from Nehemiah chapter 2. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and I gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence. So when the king said to me, why are you sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but depression, or sadness of heart, some versions say. I was overwhelmed with fear, and I replied to the king, may the king live forever. Why should I not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king asked me, what is your request? So I prayed to the God of heaven and answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I may rebuild it. The king, with the queen seated beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you return? So I gave him a definite plan, and it pleased the king to send me. I also said to the king, if it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates River, so that they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress and the city wall and the home where I will live." And the king granted my request, for I was graciously strengthened by God. I went to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent officers of the infantry and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard that someone had come to seek the well-being of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. So this is the account that we have from Nehemiah of what happened, how Nehemiah is called to action. If you'll remember from last week, Nehemiah's position in the Persian government was that of a cupbearer. So he was a person that brought the king his food and his wine. He served the king. He was at the right hand of the king. And most biblical scholars say that this position was not just simply a servant position. This was a position that required the person to be absolutely trustworthy. And you would imagine that's true. If the person tasting your food, you have to trust them not to actually poison your food, right? This person had the trust of the king to the point where the king would put his life in this person's hands. And so we can see that Nehemiah had been placed in this position. And it speaks a little bit to Nehemiah's character, maybe, that he was there, just of his trustworthiness. But Nehemiah is in this position, and there's something that we kind of need to understand when we talk about kind of the story, and that is the cupbearers and the people of the court all behaved by a very strict protocol. And so that's going to come into play. It is part of the reason that Nehemiah has some fear going into this. But the first verse here, it says, during the 20th year of the month of Nisan, the 20th year. And something that I think is interesting, a observation that we can make looking at the text, is this, that the first report came to Nehemiah. It says the first report comes in the month of Chislev, all right? So, or Kislev, as it's on my chart here. So Kislev is when Nehemiah first hears about what's happening in Jerusalem. And we read that account in chapter 1, and then we see Nehemiah praying this prayer to God. And at the end of the prayer, it says this, it says, as I said before, please grant your servant success today. And then we get to chapter 2, and chapter 2 says, during the month of Nisan, so you can see by looking at our little Jewish calendar up here that the month of Nisan is actually 4 months after the month of Kislev. All right? There's 4 months' time that happens between chapter 1 and chapter 2. There's 4 months' time. And it's interesting that during this time, it says that Nehemiah mourns and he prays and he fasts, and it says for a number of days. But it doesn't say what the number is. Now, I don't know if he did it. It doesn't say if he did it the whole time. But I think it's something that we can rightly assume is that between the time of chapter 1 and the time of chapter 2, Nehemiah was constantly in prayer for what was about to happen in chapter 2. That's how big of a deal, that is how big this hard thing is that Nehemiah is about to do, that he spends 4 months doing this, praying to God. And I don't know if he prayed the exact same prayer every time or not. It doesn't say. But it does say that he spent the time in fasting and prayer leading up to that. And I think that's important anytime we're faced with a hard thing. And we might not always have 3 or 4 months when we are faced with a hard thing. But the idea that we turn to God and that we seek him out as a first step to what we do in a hard thing is really important. It's really important to Nehemiah. And so Nehemiah has done this. It says that he is before the king, and he's giving the king wine. And there's kind of a confusing thing. If you don't understand, like I said before, what the protocol was for being in the court of the king, there was a protocol that's kind of maybe foreign to us. I've got some emojis up here. You might be wondering, what in the world are those about? But the protocol for the court, and for many courts of that time, actually, I'm just going to read it to you. An excerpt here from the Topical Bible gives a very good, succinct kind of definition of what's going on. It says, in the ancient Near East, kings were often regarded as semi-divine figures, and their courts were places of strict protocol. The expectation was those that served in the king's presence would reflect the prosperity and the stability of the kingdom, often through a demeanor of joy and contentment. Sadness, or any negative emotion, could be seen as a reflection of the king's failure to maintain order and happiness in the realm. So this is a piece of context that's really important for us, because it really shows us, why is it that Nehemiah is so worried about what's about to happen? And why is it such a big deal that Nehemiah comes into the king's presence with a sad demeanor? It's important because that just wasn't done. You did not do that. And kings back then were not usually overly generous with those kind of things. If you didn't follow the rules, bad things happened. If you look at the book of Esther, if you came uninvited before the king and he did not extend his scepter to you, you were executed, right? That's the same kind of court. It's the same court that Nehemiah is in, possibly the same building Nehemiah is in. And so these court protocols were so important, and that's why it is such a big deal that what happens next when he says, I took the wine in and gave it to the king, and I'd never been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, why are you sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but depression or sadness of heart. I like the idea of sadness of heart a little bit better. But the king recognizes this happening. And the important thing to remember about this, or the important thing to consider about this, is that Nehemiah made a conscious decision. This isn't Nehemiah was feeling kind of down and the king noticed it. You just didn't go into the king's presence with a sad demeanor. Nehemiah made a conscious decision that he was going to be sad in the presence of the king. And so when Nehemiah is faced with the hard decision, he makes this conscious decision to step out and to express his emotion. And I don't know that there's any direct parallel from that. I think the action is what is important here, that he went ahead and did it even though he knew there was consequences to it. But he steps out in faith and he expresses his emotion. And it says in the following verses, when the king said this to Nehemiah, that Nehemiah said he was overwhelmed with fear, but replied to the king. He was overwhelmed with fear, but he replied to the king. And I talked a little bit about before, sometimes the hard thing, we don't do the hard thing because we're afraid to do the hard thing, right? Sometimes we don't do the hard thing because we're afraid to do it. Nehemiah was afraid to do the hard thing here. He actually had some fear that this was not going to end well for him. He'd already bit the bullet. He'd already expressed his emotion in front of the king. It's too late to go back on that probably. But at this point, Nehemiah could have said, he could have said any number of things to answer why it was that he was sad. But he answers in truth why it is he's sad. And he does that for a reason. There's a reason that Nehemiah is able to do that. And the reason that Nehemiah is able to do that is because Nehemiah trusts in what God has planned more than he fears what might happen to him. So Nehemiah trusts more in what God has than he fears what could happen to him. And that is it's a really common theme in a lot of biblical characters. The reason it's a common theme is because we have a word for that. The word that describes what it means to trust God more than you fear what might happen to you. And that word is faith. It's a word that goes through all of Scripture. It's the word faith. And the word faith is a word that encompasses that idea of we trust God more than we fear anything else. A good example maybe just to illustrate this, I had the opportunity when I was in college to work at a summer camp. I worked at a summer camp for a couple years, Camp Timberlake, if anybody, will shout out to them if anybody's been there. But I worked there for a couple years, and we had at the camp something that a lot of camps have, a high ropes course. And I don't know if any of you guys have done high ropes courses. It's basically the idea that you climb up someplace high and you do some silly things, and you get that kind of adrenaline rush. They had something there called the power pole. They called it the power pole. And just so you get a picture of what the power pole is, a power pole is a 40-foot tall telephone pole that has just been planted in the ground. And it's got rungs along the side of it, just a pole with rungs on it. And then behind it, there's two more poles, and strung between them is a trapeze bar. And so the goal of the power pole was to climb to the top of this pole, and when you got to the top, you were facing one direction. So you got to the top, and you had to stand on top of the pole, which is, 10 inches around, and look forward. And then you have to turn 180 degrees around to face the trapeze bar. And then once you faced the trapeze bar, you had to jump off the top of the pole and grab the trapeze bar. Now, I'm a little bit taller. It wasn't as long of a jump for me as some other people, but you still had to do that. And it's illustrative of this idea of what faith encompasses. Would I have done that activity if I did not trust the safety equipment that I was connected to? Because this whole time, you don't just climb up the pole. You've got a harness on. You're strapped to a bunch of gear up top, and there's somebody down the bottom belaying you so that if you slip, you don't hit the ground. But my trust was in those people and that apparatus to keep me safe. I would never have even attempted to do the power pole without the safety gear on, without the people there to monitor that. The reason I was able to do what I was able to do and jump out and grab that bar was because my trust in those things was greater than my fear of falling and hitting the ground. And that's because there was some evidence of that. Nehemiah has that same response. He trusts God enough that he's willing to put his life on the line to say what he's about to say to the king, even though he is afraid of what might happen. So as the king asks this, Nehemiah answers the question. He answers the question very simply by saying, the land that of my forefathers is in ruin, and I'm sad because of that reason. And the king then asks, well, what can we do about this? And so Nehemiah asks for permission to go back and rebuild the walls of the city. Nehemiah steps out in faith. He makes a step of faith, and God steps in and answers him through the king. And we're going to see that Nehemiah acknowledges that. But before we get there, there's something interesting that happens, and that is when Nehemiah asks, the king responds positively, and he says, yes. What are your plans for that? And Nehemiah follows up his initial request of faith by asking for more stuff. You'll see in the verses that follow, now he says, I also said to the king, Nehemiah also said to the king. So the king asks him what he can do, and then when the king grants that, Nehemiah tags on. He said, well, if you're faithful to do this here, let's see what else we have in store, right? And so Nehemiah says, also, can I have letters giving me protection? It says, if it pleases the king, may I have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates, so that they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah, and have a letter written to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. So Nehemiah builds on his faith. He says, faith is here, and I'm going to take this faith, and if God answered me once, God will answer me twice. And so he makes this request of the king for provisions on top of just being able to go and have permission. He's also asked for provisions. And the king also grants that. In fact, it's interesting to see, if you read a little bit further, that not only does the king grant the permission to rebuild the city and the resources to rebuild the city, But it says a little bit further down in the passage that it says, he also sent with him officers of the infantry and cavalry. That's not something that Nehemiah asked for, but it's something the king grants in addition to his request. And we see that when Nehemiah acts in faith, not only does God provide for him what he has requested, but he also provides above and beyond. He gets an above and beyond because of the generosity of the king, which is a result of what God is doing. And it's interesting to see that during this 4 months that Nehemiah was praying, Nehemiah was also planning. Nehemiah was also planning on what to do. When the king asks him the question, what do you want? Nehemiah had an answer. He had an answer for what he wanted because Nehemiah had taken some time to plan what he wanted. In fact, when he gets further down and he's asking specifics, he has a specific time that he has in mind. He has specific materials that he has in mind. Nehemiah has taken time to put together a plan of what he is going to do. And that is really, in one way, a sign of the faith that Nehemiah has in God, that he's willing to put together a plan. You don't put together a plan if you don't trust that the plan is going to be able to be enacted, right? And then there's another thing that is really interesting about Nehemiah and about Nehemiah's faith here. It says that he had been praying all along. He gets to the king, and the king asks him what he wants, and he's very afraid. But it also says that Nehemiah, it says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. He prayed to the God of heaven. Nehemiah, when he's faced with the hard thing and the chips are down and he's already been praying to God, he throws up a prayer to God in the moment. Sometimes we talk badly of saying a prayer in the moment of distress. Some people kind of frown on that, and I think when you take that apart from the rest of your walk with the Lord and you say, well, I only turn to God in those moments where I'm in distress, you know what? There's nowhere in Scripture says that God doesn't hear those requests. And there's nowhere that says that we shouldn't pray those requests. And sometimes we are in the hard spot, and the chips are down, and we don't know what to do. And we have the ability to go to the God of heaven, just like Nehemiah said, and make a request to the God of heaven. And you don't get the impression from reading this that this is a big, long prayer that Nehemiah stood there and prayed while the king was waiting for an answer. You get the impression that he said, God help. God help. And that is a statement of faith. That prayer in itself is a statement of faith because that really is what we're saying when we say we have faith. It is putting our trust above our fear, and Nehemiah demonstrates that by saying, I trust you, God, I'm calling out to you, and I trust that what you're going to do, you're going to be faithful to who you said you are, and you're going to be faithful to what you said you're going to do. And so Nehemiah has this moment of fear, but he also has this moment of faith. And when we're in those situations, there is no reason for us not to reach out to God in those moments. It talks about we'll get to a little bit later. I kind of jumped ahead to what we should do with that. But then the last observation I wanted to make out of the text is the observation that when Nehemiah stepped out in faith to do what God wanted him to do, there was some very real opposition. There was some very real opposition, and we're going to be exploring that opposition in depth through our study of Nehemiah, because this isn't the only time it happens. But it says at the end of our passage today that when Sanballat, that's an interesting name, Sanballat the Hornite and Tobiah the Ammonite heard that someone had come to seek the well-being of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. That when somebody steps out in faith for the well-being of God's people, there was some opposition. And I think all of those observations are good. They're all observations that, while maybe they aren't all direct parallels to where we are or what we're about, there's some really important principles, some really important lessons that we can take from that. And so when we're faced with the hard things, just some reminders for us of what can we do when we're faced with the hard things? We've seen what Nehemiah did when he was faced with the hard things. What are some things that we can do when we're faced with the hard things? And the first one, as I just talked about, is the idea that we can go to God when we're faced with the hard things. He wants to hear that. In Philippians, it talks about, in the context of confessing sins, but it talks about in James, the diligent, effective, fervent prayer of the righteous man availeth much. Now, I use the King James there. It's hard to say. But I like the words that he uses. The effectual, fervent prayer. The original Greek words that are used there convey that meaning, that it is prayer that is diligent and fervent. And if you think about the story of Nehemiah, 4 months of fervent, diligent prayer. Prayer changes things. God wants us to talk to him. He wants us to come to him in relationship in our time of need. Philippians 4 talks about the idea that we can ask, that he wants us to ask him for the things that we need. And so the first thing we can do is go to God. The second thing that we can do, and this is kind of one that is maybe a little bit more, I don't know, you may or may not do this. Sometimes we're thrust into hard situations and we have no choice of getting there or not getting there. But I think something that we can think about when God has called us to move, and something we talked about last week, when God has called us to move, we need to respond to his call. And Nehemiah does that. He responds with some actual very deliberate action. It wasn't a mistake he was looking sad in front of the king. It was deliberate action. When God is calling us to do something, we need to respond with deliberate action. We need to think about, what is he calling us to do, and how do we do it? And then the third thing that we can do when we're faced with opposition, with a hard thing, third thing we can do is respond in faith. I actually put it up here, exercise your faith. I like this idea of faith as an exercise. There's something that's really cool about faith, and it's something that's really cool that's illustrated in Nehemiah's story about faith. And that is that faith, when it's exercised, results in more faith. You see it in the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah steps out in faith. He asks the king for permission, and when the king says yes, Nehemiah says, God was faithful here. I'm going to ask for something else. Faith builds faith. When we act in faith, it builds our faith. When we see God answer in our lives in faith, it leads to more faith. And not just in us. It leads to faith in the people that are around us. When people see that God is faithful in our lives, they can see that he will be faithful in their lives. The flip side of that is that if we don't exercise faith, our faith, and we say, my faith is in word and thought, and I don't exercise it, not only do we not have the ability then to see God work in our own lives, but we miss out on that ability to see God build the faith in the people around us as well. James talks a little bit about the idea of faith without actions, and how poor of a faith it is if your faith does not result in action. Nehemiah's faith that God would provide resulted in him stepping out in action. And it's an opportunity for us to exercise our faith when we are in hard situations. It's an opportunity for us to build our faith. It's an opportunity for us to build the faith of the people around us. And so when God calls, we need to step out with decisive action in faith. And the third thing, kind of as an afternote, maybe not an afternote, but a kind of a temper our excitement a little bit, is that when that happens, when we step out in faith and we seek the welfare of God's people, whether that's in our church or in our communities, wherever we're at, wherever we're doing God's work and serving him, we can expect that there is going to be some opposition to that message. And we don't experience that opposition here in the way other people in other parts of the world experience it, and we're very thankful for that. But it is a real thing. There's a real component of stepping out in faith that causes other people to say, I don't know if I want you to do that. If I'm not following the Lord and I see you stepping out in faith, that's going to lead me to some kind of conviction. And boy, I really don't care for that conviction stuff. I would rather not feel guilty about anything. I would rather not be convicted of anything. And so it leads to opposition. We see the opposition that is here and throughout the book of Nehemiah. And then the last kind of thing that we can take, and there's more things, I could keep going, but I've probably gone long enough. There's the last thing that I'd like for us to look at and see is how Nehemiah responds when God answers his requests. He responds, if you look with me at verse 7, the end of verse 7, it says that God graciously, that I was graciously strengthened by God. The king granted my request, for I was graciously strengthened by my God. When Nehemiah understands what God has done, when Nehemiah has stepped out in faith and seen God answer, Nehemiah gives glory where the glory is due. Not only does his actions bring glory to God in rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem, but his words give glory to God in recognizing that it was God behind it all the whole time. This wasn't about the king of Babylon. This wasn't about the might of the king of Babylon. This was about the power of God and the fact that God was directing that man's heart to answer Nehemiah's prayer. And Nehemiah gives that glory. And when the people around see that glory, that is exactly what Nehemiah was attempting to do by rebuilding the city, point people to God. And when we are in these spots where we are doing the hard thing or we're faced with the hard thing and God takes us through the hard thing, our response should be to say, God is the one who took me through the hard thing. I didn't muscle my way through it. I didn't pull myself up by the bootstraps. God came along and strengthened me to do what he asked me to do. And we can always have faith in the fact that God strengthens us to do what he's asked us to do. When he calls us to do something, we can have the assurance that he's going to be there when we respond in action. And that's what kind of today's message out of the book of Nehemiah is all about. Last week, we talked a little bit about this idea of what does it mean to be moved by God, moved to action, moved to where God has called us and what God has called us to do. And I wanted to take just a moment at the end of the service here to put into practice something that Nehemiah did. And that is, I would like for us to just spend a couple minutes. You can do it quietly where you're at. But I would like to spend a couple minutes reflecting and asking God, where is it that you're moving me to act? What do you have for me? Maybe he's got something big for you right now. Maybe he's got something small for you right now. But I would like for us to ask God. So I'm going to pray and close this up, and then I'm going to give us a few minutes just to think about that, to pray about that to God. Heavenly Father, thank you for your message that you are always faithful, that we can put our faith in you. When you came to earth and died on the cross, when you said, if you put your faith in me, I will give you eternal life. I will forgive your sins. That we can step out and put our faith in that. We can always trust you to do what you say you're going to do. And we thank you for that. And as we spend a moment here, just that we ask you that you would reveal to us, where is it that you would want us to move? How is it that you would want us to step out in a act of faith, that we would follow you, that we would bring glory to your name and who you are, that we would help build your kingdom. So I pray that you would reveal those to us as we spend the next moments in prayer.